as soon as they could. The Ukrainian army sounded the alarm and began the massive assault that had been expected. Russian troops trying to push on the Eastern Front were met with a nightmare by courageous Ukrainian fighters. Russian troops reportedly withdrew to the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk central districts after 2 days of retreating from the front. The Ukrainian army suffered significant losses in both manpower and ammunition during the long winter months spent preparing for this counterattack. Once the strategies have been developed, the necessary weapons and ammunition have been secured and everything was ready to go. He unleashed the unexpected counterattack. Ukrainian forces have already liberated an area 250 kilometers in diameter from Russian occupation. In addition, at least 50,000 Russian personnel have been killed or injured, according to estimates. No single side is singled out for the counterattacks. Attention! The Ukrainian army is also making a gallant effort to break through the Russian army's line of defense to the south. Ukrainian forces dedicated the bulk of their personnel and hundreds of armored vehicles to the conflict in the direction of Zaporizhia, in an effort to break through the barriers set by the Russians there, turning the area into a high-risk combat zone. Ukrainian government officials claim their military is giving the Russian military a tough time in and around the city of Orikov. The 291st Regiment's fighters, as well as intelligence special forces pilots and artillerymen, are having trouble repelling Ukrainian army attacks. They have the backing of the Russian 70th Regiment. Ukrainian soldiers were able to break through Russia's front lines and accomplish their goal. Russian forces have lost a lot of men, but they are trying to shore up what they still control. The Ukrainian armed forces are sending more soldiers to the operation so they can keep and even increase their control over the area. The situation in the Rubetino area became so dangerous that the Russian troops had to evacuate their posts and retreat quickly. The Russian forces in this area have been mostly taken over by the Ukrainian army, allowing them to achieve considerable gains. When confronted with the Ukrainian army's repeated attacks, however, the Russian defense forces will not hesitate to retaliate. The Russian Air Force is taking proactive measures to suppress both the Ukrainian forces and the advance of the army. However, the Russian Air Force is having trouble in general because of the use of surface-to-air missiles by Ukrainian strike troops. The area's stress levels are extremely high due to their inability to prevent the advances of the Ukrainian army. The morale of the Russian troops has entirely collapsed. The Ukrainian military is now undertaking offensive operations in the Donbass and southern Ukraine against numerous sectors of the Russian defense line. All of Kiev's assault troops have landed and are making solid progress forward, but the city has not yet issued a statement. What really is going on in Donbass, though? There is a heavy battle happening in the southern part of Donbass as Ukrainian forces are making an assault on Russian defensive lines. The infantry, tanks, and artillery of the Ukrainian army have all contributed to the army's success. However, the Ukrainian assault is being hampered to some degree by the ongoing existence of Russian defense fortifications. The Russian military has built the longest line of defensive fortifications in recent memory in response to months of speculation about a likely Ukrainian invasion. Most of these fortifications feature 3 or 4 distinct layers of defense. The first 2 layers of defense are usually designed to fail, but they nevertheless serve an important purpose by slowing down the invaders and diverting them away from vulnerable areas. Although Ukraine remains on the attack, the Kremlin insists it still holds the initiative. Muravka settlement near Donetsk, where the front line has hardly budged since 2015, was the target of a failed Chechen invasion attempt. There is likely still an order for Russian forces to start the attack as soon as feasible, according to British military officials. Meanwhile, further to the south in Kherson, the situation remains tenuous after the Kakhovka Dam and the hydroelectric generating facilities near it collapsed. The Russian fortifications were wiped out by the water that followed the dam's failure, and the country's armed forces were forced to retreat to the east as a result. What caused the fall of the Kakhovka Dam and what effects it had remain mysteries. The Kakhovka Dam has been a pivotal point in the war effort from the very beginning since the Russians had stopped pushing in front of Mykolaiv. The fighting had halted at the dam as the first month of the conflict came to an end. Kherson posed a serious logistical problem because its supplies had to be delivered across bridges to reach the city from the opposite bank of the Dnieper River. During the first stages of the enormous assault on Kherson that began in the fall of 2022, these bridges came under fire. The Russians' logistical problems worsened during the onslaught, and talk of a potential withdrawal from the conflict spread. While draining the reservoir, it was revealed that the Novokakhovka Dam had been compromised. Obviously, this sort of stuff didn't happen back then. The dam was too durable to be demolished by regular artillery, and so was the nearby bridge. These bridges remained impervious to Russian use of their powerful Mars rockets for several months after the Russians withdrew. The Antonivka Bridge was blown up using powerful explosives. The bridge had survived earlier high-altitude Martian attacks. No documentation exists at this time to confirm whether or not shells were fired at the dam. There are, however, two potential outcomes. It is possible that a vehicle carrying explosives drove across the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland, that an unmanned aerial vehicle UAV flew over the area, or that a sabotage squad planted explosives on the ground. This bridge links Crimea to the Russian mainland. It's not as simple an answer to who blew up the dam as one might think. There are benefits and drawbacks for both parties in the aftermath of the disaster. It would be a national disaster for Russia if this dam broke down before the fall of 2022, considering they are already there and the area may soon be flooded. This is the best option. If this were to happen, it would be easy to say without a shadow of a doubt that the Ukrainians were behind the attack. Crimea, however, is responsible for most of the harm that the Russians have experienced as a result of this disaster. After Russia's takeover of Crimea in 2014, access to clean water has become a top need there. The North Crimean Canal provided Crimea with the water it needed to flourish after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. This canal was shut off, leaving the area severely short on water. After the Kerch Bridge was built, water was sent to Crimea from the Russian mainland, but it was clear that this wouldn't be enough. This is due to the fact that 72% of North Crimea Canal water is used for agricultural purposes, 10% for industrial purposes, and 8% for public purposes. Kakhovka Dam is located in the Dnieper River, which also supplies water for the North Crimean Canal. The Russians re-established contact with Crimea via this channel after the crisis broke out in 2022. However, after the dam was broken, Crimea once again served as a functional water source. The Russians' gain from this strike is conditional on whether or not the Ukrainians go on the offensive. The fact that this disaster occurred just days into the big offensive and that the Ukrainians have been reliably informed that they are making significant progress points the finger squarely at the Russians. Russia says it had nothing to do with the incident. For any prospective landings between Kherson and Zaporizhia, the Ukrainians will be in charge of the western leg of the landing. All of the river's islets were swept up in the flood. To rephrase, even if Ukraine had such a strategy, it would be more difficult to implement at this point in time. Does Ukraine have anything to gain from this bomb going off? Disrupting Crimea's access to its water supply was the Ukrainians' biggest victory. Further, the water level in the river was high enough that it flooded Russian positions on the other side of Kherson. Russian servicemen's deaths are rumored to have occurred in this war. This dam is one of several that have been damaged throughout the conflict. Numerous localities experienced water shortages as a result of damage to dams on the Oskol River and the Kryvyi Dam in the Luhansk region. The environment and citizens are the ones that suffer the most. Even if we disregard Ukraine's interests, the flooding had an impact on dozens of local towns. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of animals of all sizes perished. The number of civilians killed in this war is still a mystery. The threat from nuclear weapons is also on the rise. Nearby at the dam is the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, which uses water from the reservoir to cool its reactors. International authorities have started keeping an eye on this power complex after Russia's government claimed that its neighbors were building a military post. In short, it's debatable who came out on top of this calamity. But it's not up for argument that nature and regular people suffered losses. How the dam's collapse may affect the ongoing Ukrainian military campaign is currently unknown. So tell me, what is your take on the situation generally? Please leave your feedback below. I value hearing from you. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications so that you don't miss any of our future video uploads. Russian civilians are leaving Putin's residence on the peninsula in droves. More than 100,000 Russians have left the Crimean Peninsula in the past 2 weeks. Russian forces in Crimea have suffered heavy casualties as a direct result of actions launched by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army has been using US-supplied long-range missiles in its operations against Russian soldiers inside and outside of Ukraine. It has been operational at strategic Russian outposts and ammo storage sites on the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Peninsula is home to these facilities after Vladimir Putin realized he could not ensure the safety of the territory. A large number of Russian residents living in Crimea left. Iranian commander Vladimir Zelensky frequently gives talks in the area. See, at the end of every conversation, Zelensky promises that once Crimea is liberated from Russian rule, the Russian occupiers will immediately leave. The Ukrainian government will also take charge. Zelensky recently addressed the Ukrainian parliament and declared that the Ukrainian army would launch a major offensive on the Crimean Peninsula, which has been under Russian control for decades. Leaders in the Ukrainian parliament extended an invitation to Zelensky to join a ruling alliance following his remarks. It took the army of Ukraine 3 weeks after Zelensky's announcement to launch the operation that would liberate the Crimean Peninsula. In response to the Ukrainian military's actions, more than 100,000 Russians fled Crimea. Mariupol has been the target of a Ukrainian air onslaught for the past few months. The Ukrainian intelligence service took measures to destroy the munitions stockpile in the city of Mariupol after learning that ammunition and other military equipment were being transported there for transit to the Crimean Peninsula. The Russian ammunition cache at the port of Mariupol was discovered thanks to the joint efforts of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and the United States Intelligence Service. The United States Intelligence Agency provided the Ukrainian authorities with the results of the satellite imaging analysis. The Russian munitions buildup near Mariupol prompted the Ukrainian military to launch an operation of reprisal. The Ukrainian military's powerful Mars missiles came from the Mariupol munitions depot and were used in the Dnipro battle. The missiles were relocated there after the launch in a couple of minutes. High-powered Mars rockets arrived in Mariupol, confirming Vladimir Putin's prediction that there would be enough to wipe out Russia's armaments stockpile. Vladimir Putin has sent as many as 400 aircraft systems to the port of Mariupol in preparation for a probable aerial assault by the Ukrainian Air Force. Russian air defenses were successful in countering Ukrainian Mars missiles fired from high altitude. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense didn't try to destroy the ammunition depot in Mariupol, but rather the principal supply in Crimea. Unfortunately, the procedure did not work. Most of the weapons and ammunition supplied to Russian troops in Ukraine are thought to have entered the country via the Crimean Peninsula. Americans and Ukrainians working together successfully located the primary Russian weapons depot in Simferopol, Crimea. American spies were able to determine the precise location of the ammunition stockpile and relay this intelligence to the Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainian armed forces wasted little time getting ready to wipe out the main supply of ammunition. Local Ukrainian separatists who were present helped confirm that no air defense system protected the ammunition cache. There is therefore a chance that this attack will be fruitful. The Ukrainian military tried a second air strike, this time against an ammo storage facility in Washington after the first one failed. This time, however, Mars is firing long-range, high-altitude missiles. The Martian rockets were able to do damage because they broke Crimean airspace rules by flying at extraordinarily high elevations. After counting down the seconds, they detonated near the Russian St. Veropol ammunition depot. The aftermath of the explosion for the locals in that region of Russia caught them completely off guard. Russian citizens in Crimea hid in underground bunkers as shells rained down on their neighborhoods. The greatest ammo depot held by the Russian army was destroyed thanks to a successful operation carried out by the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian military not only allowed almost 100,000 Russians to flee Crimea, but they also destroyed Russian munitions storage facilities. As a result of this latest tragedy, the Russian people no longer have any faith in Vladimir Putin as their leader. The explosions and fires on the Crimean Peninsula have done serious damage to Putin's credibility. Vladimir Putin is complying with the wishes of the Russian people and leaving Crimea. He cannot guarantee the security of the peninsula. The majority of Crimea's people are currently making an organized attempt to cross into Russia. There is currently a 4-kilometer-long line of cars waiting to move forward. The impossibility of leaving the Crimean Peninsula grew as the Court Bridge remained closed. Russians living in Crimea have also taken steps to evacuate the area, although they have done so by relocating further from the airports on the other side. A large number of Russian nationals tried to leave Crimea, but they didn't have any transportation. When Vladimir Putin heard allegations that Russian citizens were in Crimea, he swiftly decided to increase security there. Putin has decided to install 5 S-400 air defense systems in Crimea to foil any future air operations by the Ukrainian armed forces. Putin also deployed 2 Panzer anti-aircraft defense systems near the Cork Bridge at the same time. After an earlier effort at sabotage the Cork Bridge, the only land connection between Russia and Crimea was taken out of operation. The Russian troops stationed in Ukraine can't get supplies since a Cork Bridge was destroyed. Vladimir Putin suggested in December that the next attack would center on the Cork Bridge after learning that the Ukrainian military had recently increased its air operations, shifting the focus of air defense systems away from heavily populated regions and toward the Cork Bridge. Putin made the decision after learning that Ukrainian air activity had lately risen. Hundreds of air defense systems from the AS-4 can be found in and around various Russian government and military buildings and bases. It would have been ideal for the Russian people to have been able to keep their own ammunition and weapons secure. The Ukrainian army's firing rates within Russia's borders improved after they acquired long-range weapons. Vladimir Putin has constructed air defense systems in Moscow and several other Russian cities, despite the fact that the Russian army has not yet launched an airstrike against the Russian capital. Air operations have been conducted on gas infrastructure in and around the Russian capital. The Ukrainian government's military measures to impede oil exports. Russia's primary source of international currency have been mostly successful recent months, to be precise. The Ukrainian military was responsible for the destruction of a Russian-owned natural gas pipeline that provided energy to Europe. The Ukrainian military, though, is the least of Vladimir Putin's worries. Russian President Vladimir Putin has seized territory from Ukraine and relocated its people to Russian territory. The invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin and the subsequent issue of Russian passports led to a large influx of Ukrainians claiming Russian citizenship. The Ukrainian refugees who made it to Russia didn't just roll over and stop fighting on Russian territory. Ukrainian citizens who had organized amongst themselves attempted sabotage against the Russian troops. Russian President Vladimir Putin has issued an order for the military to guard natural gas pipelines running to Europe, a tactic used by active Ukrainian rebel groups. Putin has threatened to stop natural gas exports to Europe, but it is unclear if he has the resources to follow through. The Russian military has a huge financial need during wartime. Energy exports are the primary driver of this kind of income. Putin would also lose the ability to support Russia's military if oil shipments to Europe were cut off. Experts think that the likelihood of Vladimir Putin exploiting such a chance is extremely low because of Russia's dependence on energy exports to Europe. Putin regularly uses the security of gas pipelines running to Europe as a means of exerting influence on European nations. However, the gas pipelines will be operational again very soon. The latest developments surrounding the de-escalation of hostilities between Russia and Ukraine have sent shockwaves around the world. Ukrainian partisans who had been carefully trained finally showed up, providing irrefutable proof that Mariupol is an inalienable part of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army helped train local militias to fight the Russian invaders, who were met with fierce resistance by the Ukrainian people. The partisans were the most successful of the many groups. The partisans' daring and effectiveness were on display in a recent vehicle bump operation in which 3 colonels were killed. Despite the escalating violence, many Ukrainians still hold out hope that their army may achieve decisive victories with the help of support from their local communities. Over the course of this massive conflict, Ukrainians have realized that it takes more than the Ukrainian armed forces to protect their homes and country. However, a few natives enlisted in the armed forces and were properly trained. Many people's convictions in this view have been bolstered by the success of operations against Russian supporters and Russian partisans. In reality, Putin began to take the situation seriously once all of their hard work paid off, and he saw how precarious the circumstance genuinely was in their most recent mission. The partisans were able to successfully convey a message to Russian President Vladimir Putin in Mariupol. Since Putin's supporters believe that everyone and every organization with the same board will inevitably meet in the same fight, they will not rest until every inch of Ukraine is cleaned of invaders and the flag of victory is hoisted. They also think that all parties using the same board will eventually engage in battle with one another. They also said that regardless of the group's talent, the residents of Mariupol know that we have brought all we need to the city and that as long as we stay, we will bring the end of Russia. Despite their claims that the organization held great promise, they made these assertions. They maintain that their efforts are just getting started. The Russians, they say, will eventually come out of their secret layers and use all means necessary to wipe out the resistance. What these clusters will do in the next stages is entirely unclear. Despite its apprehension of the Russian troops' next move, it predicts that the killing of senior officials within those forces will be the most significant strategic triumph for the partisans. Partisans are distinguished by their reliance on bombing as a primary combat tactic. This tactic has been used in recent operations, which have been disastrous for Russia. There was talk that the Russians would brutally treat the locals and support anyone who helped the enemy. Several groups angered by the facts at hand swiftly implemented their strategies as a result. The death of these crucial individuals was central to the plans which were crafted to deal a devastating blow to the Russian army and hasten their loss. The major goal of these actions was to drive back the invading forces and help the Ukrainian people reclaim the territory that had been stolen from them illegally. In order to learn more about the 3 colonels' employment and whereabouts, they began following them. The plan was to plant explosives under the cars driven by the 3 colonels and then detonate them. All of the returning colonels have relocated to the same house on Metropolitan Street. The success of this operation can be attributed almost entirely to the colonels' indifference, which was brought on by Russian saps and tremors. Just as the car was parked in front of the house, heroic partisan organizations leapt into action and placed a remote-controlled bump underneath it. Once the colonels were safely inside the truck, the bumps they had planted would go off. The colonels went through a lot of hardship before deciding to execute those responsible for their carelessness and lack of focus. The devices were detonated by pushing the trigger in an automobile that was otherwise ready to travel without incident. The partisan strategies were carried out to the letter in full view of the Scythians. This car was blown to bits, killing all 3 colonels inside. By accomplishing this, the partisans once again proved their dominance. According to the partisan, the harm done by the Russian soldiers will increase dramatically with each subsequent encounter, and the soldiers will become so enraged at the mere mention of the partisan's name that they will leap out of their seats and awaken from a dead sleep at the sound of it. The partisan thinks Putin will dismiss the operation as a fake and go about his business as usual. The phrases and flags carried by the Ukrainian partisans inspired people all over the world and will forever be associated with their heroic actions. This helps solidify their reputation as a group that stands in support of the Ukrainian people. Partisans claim that all Russian occupation forces will be killed in the end, with special emphasis on the occupiers' hand-picked commanders. According to reports from sources outside of Ukraine, these partisan groups' involvement was crucial to the resolution of the conflict. A few days later, the leader of the Russian occupiers in Kharkovka, Andrei Stepel, and 3 colonels followed in the insurgents' footsteps who, in a similar operation, killed 80 troops and then sabotaged his car by putting a rock in the road. The Russian invading force was hesitant to take any action since the partisans' gruff and resolute demeanor made them question their every move. They obviously felt threatened, and the sudden necessity of constant patrol may have contributed to this. This showed the need to stand on principle. Partisans made sure that every square inch of Ukraine was filled with voices of protest. Just get out of here. Words and phrases that indicate force like HIMARS will help. You are common in the field of psychology. When asking for aid for Ukraine in the past, partisans frequently call themselves local troops. Many grassroots organizations in Ukraine receive substantial funding from the Ukrainian government. Communities around the United States are given the same level of consideration. Everyone who fights for Ukraine's freedom and independence agrees with this 100%. And we owe a debt of appreciation to every person on earth for making it possible. No matter the cost or effort, everything is being done with the same goal in mind: removing the Russian military from the country. Experts on wars say that when such examples emerge from an area, it strengthens people's will to fight for independence and their love of Ukraine. It makes sure that everyone in the country understands the gravity of the national war and is prepared to make sacrifices for the greater good. Russia's general stance on these issues and its perspective on them have been stated. One of the groups that Russia demonizes and watches for intelligence purposes is the Ukrainian people's resistance to the occupation. Russia has been very involved in the Ukrainian trunk show, paying agents to threaten and frighten potential partisans and supplying intelligence on firmly ensconced partisans. Russian fear of these political factions is palpable, and the country will undoubtedly take any precautions necessary to avoid a repeat of the disaster of a few years ago. Putin is worried that the partisans, despite not being organized as an army, are capable of organizing significant attacks outside of direct battles, that their opponents are fully involved, and that the damage the partisans may inflict and produce can be endless. Despite the lack of a centralized command structure, the partisans have been successful. Many experts believe that Ukraine and international support for Ukraine are the constant causes of crises in Russia. We cannot afford to ignore these personal difficulties in the midst of this tremendous struggle. Supporters of Vladimir Putin appear to be the only ones in Russia who have found a safe haven. Russian citizen Ramos Arthur Smolyanov was labeled as a Ukrainian government agent by Putin, who trusts no one, not even fellow Russian nationals. Young people across the country have reacted by saying they are afraid to speak up because they feel they have lost their autonomy. Young Russians began to abandon Putin in favor of other world leaders because they felt they owed too much to Russia and Putin specifically. They finally gained the freedom their country has suppressed for so long. Thanks to this move, Putin's tenuous hold on power is evident in every circumstance as he consistently puts himself first at the expense of the Russian people. Putin risks losing what little support he has among the Russian people as a result of this. There have been global repercussions from the current escalation between Russia and Ukraine.